Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And today's episode is all about a few of the many connections between the Percy family, owners of Alnwick Castle since 1309, and the Tudor monarchs who ruled England from 1485 until 1603.
It was towards the end of the Tudor period that the Percys gained possession of Syon House in London, by which time the house itself, which had formerly been an abbey, had already played an important role in Tudor, religious and royal history.
We spoke to Sarah Ponder from the Marketing and Visitor Services Department at Syon to find out more about the Percys, the Tudors and Syon. There are stories of royalty, reformation, science and exploration, and we hope you enjoy them and find them as interesting as we did.
We're very happy to be joined on this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast by our special guest from fellow Percy residents Syon House. It's Sarah Ponder. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, after a nice long weekend.
We're here today to talk about Syon House and the Percy family and the Tudor family and all the connections that we all share both there and at Alnwick Castle. And a good place to start might be with what Syon House was before it was a house, and that's Syon Abbey. And the end of Syon Abbey came through Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries. Can you tell us a little bit, first of all, set the scene about what happened at Syon during Henry VIII's time?
Yeah, absolutely. The great abbey at Syon had been around for about 100 years by the time of the dissolution, and by the kind of Reformation in England was starting to take hold. And Henry VIII's looking to escape his bonds of marriage with Catherine of Aragon. And whereas Henry had been a great supporter of the abbey when he was in his early years of marriage, the couple were literally living across the river at Sheen Palace and also would come to Syon Abbey. As his religious opinions changed, the suppression of it and the dissolution was absolutely monumental and very quick. And the house was built, started being built literally after Henry died. I like to think of it almost as monumental as the loss of Alnwick, but because it provided such a huge service, like many of the abbeys and monasteries, it was so important in the local community, giving out alms and support for the sick and pilgrims as well. It was a big pilgrimage site, and employment in its dairies and farms and orchards. It was an interesting setup itself, the abbey. It was a double house with 25 men and 60 women. It was a silent order mainly, and they were living by the rule of Saint Birgitta, the Swedish saint. So the abbey was headed up by an abbess and also a male confessor general, but the brethren didn't mix, so the men and the women didn't mix. They were always separate. And it was a really, really rich abbey. It was extremely rich. It had income and rents coming in from all over, from Yeovil in Somerset to Essex, Lincolnshire, and even St Michael's Mount in Cornwall. So, before all the destruction comes about, it's such a big deal that this came toppling down. If we look at it, its inception and also its clientele, you kind of get an idea of how big a deal of an abbey it was. It was really like a well-loved celebrity abbey because it was connected to the royals right from its inception. Henry V's sister, Philippa, was betrothed to Eric of Pomerania, who then was to rule Sweden and Denmark. And then when she went over and married him, and one of her ladies in waiting, in fact, her main lady in waiting was Katerina, and she was actually Saint Birgitta's granddaughter. So you've got the actual granddaughter of the saint in your royal household. So there's a lot of interest there from the English royal family with this Swedish saint right from the off. And part of her entourage when she went to Sweden to marry was a gentleman called Hugh Fitzhugh, who then brought back to England with him a number of nuns and novices to set up a house in England and reported back to the main mother house in Vadstena. What's been discovered recently, actually, is that there's been a Percy link to the Burgottines for a really long time. Before Syon was even built, there was actually a link with no other than Harry Hotspur. So he had been very keen to visit Vadstena Abbey, but Henry IV had been sending him off to fight various battles and play ambassador and that kind of thing. So he couldn't get time to visit, but he was intending to send someone to stand in for him and to pay his respects and his oblations and everything. That really only kind of came out last year. And it's such an exciting thing to think that, Percys were involved before Syon was even a thing. So the abbey itself started being built in Twickenham in about 1415, and it was Henry V that had kind of ordered it to be built. He was sort of trying to make up for the terrible things that his dad had done to Richard II. So he's setting up the King's Great Work, it was called, and it was 3 holy buildings kind of across the river from each other. But after a few years, the land was proved to be a bit marshy, a bit too marshy, and they'd kind of outgrown it already, the 85 people there. So they moved along to the site in Brentford where Syon is now, and it was there for they started kind of rebuilding that at about 1430. So around this time, obviously Henry V has gone, but Henry VI is now ploughing money into it. It was refounded, and it was also it's very integral in the Wars of the Roses as well, as a place of sanctuary, and also with various different supporters from very wealthy families. Elizabeth Woodville and Elizabeth of York came here during the Wars of the Roses, and Margaret Beaufort as well. Margaret Pole stayed at Syon Abbey when Henry Tudor came to the throne. It's a great house, and it even has its own pilgrimage indulgence that's signed off by the Pope. So, you're allowed to get some time off in purgatory if you come and do a pilgrimage to Syon. And even when the Pope then decrees that double houses should be done away with, they're not allowed anymore, the importance of Syon means that there's so many royals fighting its corner, so it stays a double house with special dispensation from the Pope. So it's a really, really, really important place. So important, that it had a massive library that was known all over Europe, a real place of male and female learning and devotion. But when we get to the 1520s, then you get those ripples of Reformation coming over from Luther in Germany, and Henry's getting restless for a male heir. So Syon really gets caught in the middle of all of that intrigue at the time. So in just a few years, it goes from the place to be seen to be seen for royals and high status pilgrims, to then be kind of torn down stone by stone as if it was never there, which is, astounding. Even when Time Team have been here, there's not a huge, we've got the crypt still, and the house obviously is built on the cloister area, but it would have been an absolutely massive abbey, almost about the size of Westminster Abbey. Now, when Henry breaks with Rome, a number of the Syon inhabitants accept his place as head of the Church of England, but there were many who didn't. So when Thomas Cromwell comes to Syon to get the oaths of, supremacy in person from the nuns and the monks, all of the nuns accept Henry as supreme head of the Church of England, but many of the monks are obstinate and resistant to taking the oath and resisting all attempts for conversion. One of them was the Confessor General, who was Richard Reynolds. He was not too impressed with Henry's actions, and he refused to take the oath of supremacy. He was arrested and taken to the Tower, and he had a terrible death, hung, drawn and quartered. And along with him also was John Hale, who was the Vicar of Isleworth. Thomas More actually saw his execution because he was in the Tower at the time as well. It could be said that Henry had a bit of a vendetta about Syon because it was one of Catherine of Aragon's favourite places, but also he'd had a run-in with Reynolds before, and that was a year or so earlier about Elizabeth Barton.
She was also known as the Holy Maid of Kent. But what can you tell us about her and what's her connection with Syon?
Yeah, absolutely. So she was, a young woman from Kent. She was about 19 when she started. She was working for a farmer, just started having these visions that then appeared to come true. She starts gaining a bit of notoriety. She actually had quite a bit of support from the church. Even Henry VIII at first supported her because her visions kind of fit in with his ideas about heresy and rebellions and that kind of thing. So in 1528, he had sent Wolsey and More to meet her at Syon Abbey, and Richard Reynolds was there as well. And later on, he met her himself a few times. So it's like she had the favour of the king and the top rulers in the land, in the government. But a few years later, she started talking about Reformation and also about his Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. His favour was obviously quickly removed, and one of the most offensive things was that she said that if he went ahead with his marriage, that he would die within a few months, and also that she said exactly where in hell he would sit. So he was pretty furious at this, and he sent Thomas Cromwell to interview her. And Thomas was, I think, trying to get her to say that she'd made it all up. I think because she'd been such a kind of celebrity mystic for a while, it took a while for them to press any charges. But in the end, she said she hadn't made it all up. It was all true visions. And so she was arrested and then taken to the Tower. So she was then hanged, and then her head was cut off. But interestingly, it was placed on a spike on London Bridge. Now, normally you'd think that's only reserved for treasonous plots and not prophecies, but actually they did charge her with treason in that she was making up visions about the king's death to make people rebel against the monarch. And she actually has the honour of being the only woman to ever have had her head on a spike on London Bridge. And interestingly, later, those that had interviewed her and questioned her also then had their heads on spikes. So More, Reynolds, and Cromwell kind of followed her in that fate. So she was, absolutely a very interesting character.
She predicted Henry VIII would only last a few months before he died, and we know he lasted a few years. So I think we should probably talk about what happened to Henry after he died. Not where he sat in hell like the Holy Maid of Kent predicted, but where his body ended up, because that's got a Syon connection as well. Could you tell us your favourite gruesome Henry VIII story, please?
Wow. This is the most wonderfully hideous part of Syon's past. And you know what? Kids absolutely love this story. And it is, it's amazing because you just wouldn't think this kind of thing, would happen at a royal funeral. Anyway, so Henry VIII died 28th of January 1547. And like it is with a monarch's death, there's lots of organising to do. There's ceremonies, there's memorials, burials, and it's all done with great show and honour and pomp. And the funeral cortege was to make its way from Whitehall to Windsor Castle for Henry to be buried. And Henry's body was encased in a lead coffin, and it was on a chariot pulled by 8 horses. And that's because the coffin itself weighed half a ton. So that's, 2,000 pounds. It's got heraldic banners. And On top of it as well is a life-size effigy of Henry VIII. It looks like Henry, it's dressed like Henry, it's wearing robes and his crown, and that's kind of being paraded through the streets as well. So the chariot had 3 stops to make before it got to St George's Chapel at Windsor. So Henry was lying in state at each stop. So first at Whitehall, and then he comes to Syon, because although the Abbey is no longer, a work in practice, there are still parts of the great church here. So we would think of a coffin being carried by a hearse. And they do use the word hearse in the 16th century, but it doesn't mean anything like we would think it means now. So we think it's a big black car. But a hearse in the 16th century was actually, it's like a wax construction, like a pergola type of thing that would go over the coffin, so like a fancy pergola, and that went over that. And he had there was 3 of them made for each different place that he was lying in state. So the coffin on the chariot with the 8 horses and all the stuff and the effigy and everything is travelling by road to Windsor, not by river. When it arrived at Syon, it was in a bit of a state. It had been shaken about a bit. It is placed in the crypt, and it was noticed that there's a crack in the coffin. And then they sent for the plumber to come and fix the lead in the morning. However, and this is what I find incredible, the coffin was not guarded. The effigy was, because the effigy has the crown and the robes, but the coffin's not being guarded. So the coffin's in the crypt. And during the night, Henry had been dead nearly 3 weeks by this time. So it's about sort of Valentine's Day, around February the 14th. So all the gases that would be involved in decomposition had started to build up in his body, and just building up and building up. And his body exploded, which is pretty gross. But because there was a crack in the coffin, the liquid, if we call it liquid, or the matter, it drips out onto the floor underneath. Now, when the plumber comes in to mend the coffin the next day, he had to shoo away dogs that had come into the church and had been licking up Henry's matter from the floor. So it's absolutely so disgusting, and you think, how could that happen in a royal funeral? But yeah, it was the crown and it was the effigy being guarded and not his body.
It might be gross, but you can understand why children like that story.
Yes, and also in the crypt now, there's been a splattering of kind of wax or some red paint or something like that, and it's, we've tried to clean it off, but we do sometimes, maybe misleadingly, perhaps say, "Oh, I wonder where Henry's body exploded," and they immediately take their foot off it or go, "Oh," because it's obviously wax or paint or something like that, but it's so nice to have. It's really funny just seeing their faces, and they just love that story. But what's weird is, before all this happened, there was a Franciscan friar, and his name was William Peto. And a few years earlier, he'd made this prophecy that because of all the terrible things that Henry had done to the church during, the Reformation and Dissolution, it's because he was such a bad king, he would be licked up like Ahab's dogs. And Ahab was a king of Israel in the Bible who was, eaten by his dogs. So not only is the story of Henry's body exploding incredible, but the fact that it was prophesied as well is unbelievable.
So after King Henry VIII died, his son became Edward VI.
Yeah.
But he didn't survive on the throne for very long, and then there was a brief period where Lady Jane Grey became queen. Can you explain what her link was with Syon?
Yes, absolutely. So we know that Henry died 1547. So Edward was very young when he came to the throne. He was about 9. So his uncle is Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. he is appointed by the kind of Regency Council to be the Lord Protector. So he's king in all but name, and he rules on the council with his advisors, and young Edward gives him the site of Syon Abbey pretty quickly. And it's still, obviously, we've had Henry's body exploding in it, so there's still parts of the church and some of the monastic buildings. But what Uncle Edward decides to do is that he's going to clear a lot of the monastic buildings. And the stone involved in the abbey, so the Caen stone, the Yorkshire stone, he is dismantling it, and he's actually building Somerset House by the Thames. So he's kind of dismantling Syon, sending all the stone down the Thames to build Somerset House. And it's on the foundations of the abbey. So it's not as large as the abbey itself, but it's kind of on the cloister footprint. In the meantime, at court, he's actually making some unpopular religious changes. And so there's some kind of resultant rebellions. So the Ket's Rebellion and the Prayer Book Rebellion. And so his close friend, or so he thinks, and fellow soldier, John Dudley, is tasked with, going into the country and tackling these various rebellions. But as you can imagine, all the backstabbing and ambition in the court at that time, Edward Seymour's thrown out by the Privy Council, and John Dudley, becomes the Lord Protector, so takes over Syon House as well. And Seymour's executed for treason. Some who were suspicious of his new house at Syon, which has crenellations in the manner of a fortress, make them suggest that he's building a fortress against the king. So that's a treasonous act. So it's a lot of trumped up charges and unpopularity as well, but he must go. So Dudley takes hold of Syon, and he's actually faced with an ailing king at that time because he is 15, unmarried. Dudley in his mind is thinking about, I think, succession. Who's coming next after Edward? And then it should be Mary, his elder sister, but Mary is Catholic. And again, all this kind of drive for power. I don't believe he wants to lose his position. So it's been kind of suggested that he has the ear of the king and is suggesting that no, he doesn't want to have his sister Mary, the Catholic, as his successor. He should find a Protestant successor. And how about his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who, what a coincidence, she is married to Dudley's son, Guildford. So it's his daughter-in-law. So Edward actually does name her as his successor instead of his sister Mary. It's all hush-hush, but Dudley has it on paper. And as soon as Edward dies in 1553, Dudley immediately gets Jane's mother and father to bring Jane to Syon House. And in the Long Gallery, she's told that she's to be the next queen. She's Edward's successor. She's not happy about this, but as a 15-year-old, she has no choice and reluctantly accepts her fate. So she is queen, hasn't been crowned yet. So she leaves Syon to go to the Tower of London for her coronation. And that's really the last place that she's a free woman, is at Syon, because she, heads along the river, goes to the Tower. She never leaves the Tower. Support for Mary is overwhelming, and Jane and Guildford and John Dudley are eventually executed for treason. Now, we've got a lovely portrait of Lady Jane Grey in our print room, and a few years ago it was I can never say this word, dendrochronologically tested. I got it out. And it's within 50 years of her death. And there's not many paintings of her, mainly because obviously she, as a traitor, seen as a traitor or an innocent traitor, pictures of her would be destroyed. So it's similar with, Anne Boleyn and some of the previous wives, just erase them as if they never existed. We do have that portrait of her, and it's kind of seen as the one that's most contemporary to her age and, within sort of 50 years of her death. And we've also got portraits of Edward as a toddler, the kind of one that's sort of after Hans Holbein, and a few of some of the Tudors as well. So even Prince Arthur and the children of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But yeah, very sad end for a 15-year-old that didn't even want to be queen.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, very much so. But it's nice that that portrait's still at Syon. It's one of many portraits in the rooms there, including plenty of Percy family portraits.
Yes.
So we're going to skip ahead into the Elizabethan era towards the end of the Tudor period and talk about the Percy family member who brought Syon into the family's possession right at the end of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. Can you tell us about the 9th Earl of Northumberland? He's somebody we speak about a lot on the podcast, but you probably know more than most about the Wizard Earl.
I absolutely adore the Wizard Earl. He's my favourite, definitely. Brings Syon into the ownership of the Percys, and that's through his marriage to Dorothy Devereux, who had possession of it through her first husband, Thomas Parrot, and it's been in the family ever since. So he had leasehold of it from 1594, and then James I gave him the freehold of it in 1604. So it had, after the Dudleys, it had kind of reverted to the crown, and then this is the next kind of chapter in its history, is the Percy chapter. So it's been in the Percy ownership ever since. So he is an amazing character. He's a Renaissance man. He's a humanist with humanist thought of, you fulfill yourself to your greatest potential and you support people on your way. So he wasn't really into kind of the whole showing your wealth, showing off, that kind of thing. He was really, really interested in knowledge and learning. And he surrounded himself with similar kind of thinkers and philosophers and mathematicians, poets, explorers, astronomers, and he actually bankrolled all of them. He provided the financial support to many of them. Thomas Harriot, in particular, was a scientist and astronomer. He was pretty much a polymath, and he was working for the 9th Earl, the Wizard Earl, for a very long time, for most of his life, and actually lived at Syon as well.
So you mentioned that you loved the Wizard Earl, and you've said a little bit about him, but what are some of your favourite facts or stories about him?
It's funny, he's my favourite historical character. He's not just at Syon or Alnwick, not just as a Percy, but just generally in history. He's so embroiled in, or almost if he's got into these events and these major happenings by accident sometimes. But he's got so many connections, not only in British history, but North American history as well. So I think probably my favourite thing is his kind of transformation from a young man who comes into his earldom quite young. His father had kind of died suspiciously at the Tower of London, so the 8th Earl, and he comes into his titles, his lands, his wealth at a young age, and he kind of goes off the rails a bit. He's had no preparation. He wastes his money on wine, women and song and hawking, and do all sorts of different pursuits, like you would when you've just won the lottery, really. But he's in Paris, and he becomes ill and realizes what he's squandered. He goes about completely changing his whole outlook and his approach to running his estates, and he becomes this kind of ultra efficient land manager, makes his estates incredibly profitable, so then he can afford to support these scientists and philosophers and mathematicians and explorers financially. So he did marry, and he did have children, and he did have heirs, but it wasn't a love match. It was a very fiery, kind of tempestuous marriage. They didn't really get on. The love of his life was learning. So he really kind of, even in Paris, he's kind of upset over a girl. So before he's met his wife, he's upset over a girl, and he just completely throws himself into these weird new books that he's found, like even occult books and really strange new books. And he finds himself. He completely heals his broken heart with the love of knowledge, and he's friends with Kit Marlowe as a young man, and he runs in similar circles to sort of Raleigh and Shakespeare, loads of poets, and all these, this kind of brand new age of science and learning. And he invites all these people to come to Syon, to the library, to talk about the new sciences. And the establishment are kind of suspicious because, anything that's kind of against the church or against the teachings of the day is all seen as heretical or to do with the devil. And they nickname them the School of Night. But really, I think it's actually, so this gang of all these clever people, I just think it's the Tudor equivalent of, the Big Bang Theory.
Yes.
For me, that's what it is. It's just this group of nerds that are really excited about new discoveries, and people are just accusing them of all these different things. But really, I just love that he's a real kind of geeky nerd.
And I've got to ask, which one of the Big Bang Theory characters do you think he's most like?
Oh, I think he's Sheldon. I do. You've got that. He's involved in the School of Night. He's also involved with Raleigh and with Thomas Harriot. They've been explorers and they've been to the New World. So you get this amazing link with the New World and that kind of new, you even get like Pocahontas even comes into his life. It's just such an incredible character. And then there's also all the intrigue surrounding the gunpowder plot. So it's like he stumbles into all of these weird happenings and he's got nothing to do with it. But it's just, guilt by association in a lot of cases.
So if people want to come and find out about him and find out about Lady Jane Grey and about Henry VIII's exploding body and all these things, tell us about visiting Syon this year in 2023. How can people come and see all of this stuff and find out these stories?
Absolutely. So we have guided tours on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and they give the whole kind of gamut of the history of the Percys at Syon and also the history of the Abbey as well. On Sundays and bank holidays, we have kind of a roam at your own pace. Now, we're really known for our guides, like you are at Alnwick, being so friendly and informative, and our guides just love to chat. So anyone with a specific kind of query can approach any of our guides in the rooms. There's so many different things to cite. So, it's a palimpsest, really. You've got a medieval abbey, and then you've got Tudor gruesome history, and then you've got this amazing 18th century Robert Adam interior that doesn't show any of the Tudor history that kind of lies beneath it. But when you go down into the crypt, you can see the outlines of the vaulted ceilings of the abbey as well. So it's a real kind of mix of lots of different periods of history. We're open Wednesday through to Sunday and bank holidays, and that's for the gardens, and we've got beautiful conservatory. And then the house is open Wednesdays, Thursdays, Sundays and bank holidays. So yes, do come along. It's lovely grounds to have a picnic as well and sit under a tree where Elizabeth I may have sat.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us. Really learned some more things that I didn't know about the Percy history, so thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
If If you'd like to hear more about the history of Syon before and after the Tudor period, please go back to episode 10 of the podcast where Daniel found out all about it. And if you'd like to visit Syon House, it is open Wednesdays, Thursdays and Sundays until the end of October this year.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast, please subscribe to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Let us know what you think by emailing podcast@alnwickcastle.com, and please recommend us to your friends.
Join us again in 2 weeks for a look at another part of Alnwick Castle's history. Until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.